This is a summary of changes to the 2018 Rainfall Index Annual Forage Program. I'm going to make some assumptions, and that is that you know quite a bit about the Rainfall Plan of Insurance already, and that you're somewhat familiar with annual forage as well. So this is going to focus mainly on the changes that RMA made to the annual forage program for 2018. That said, there is no change to the availability. You can see the states, same as last year. One of the big changes is that we now have one sales closing date for all these states. Last year we had two, we'd have one this year, and it is July 15th. The other major changes are highlighted on this slide. I'll talk about them now, and we'll touch on each one of them in a little more detail in the remaining slides. So again, one sales closing date. All insureds have to complete a new application. Because of the changes that RMA made, the applications and the choices that the insured had last year will not be valid for this year. So between now and July 15th, any existing insured that you had is going to need to complete a new application. Any new insured obviously has the same deadline on July 15th. We now have 4 growing seasons, and those are determined by the planting date of the forage. Last year we had 2, we now have 4. The insured must choose the intervals for the entire year by 7/15. So between now and 7/15, they're going to have to understand the changes and make the choices within each one of the 4 growing seasons by 7/15. They may not plan on planting in all 4 growing seasons, but they still have to make choices as if they were. So in the event that they do not get planted in the growing season they elected, their coverage will just carry over into the next growing season, and coverage will be in place no matter when they plant throughout the year. The acreage reporting dates and plant dates were changed to match up with those 4 growing seasons. We'll show you those in a little bit. Basically, the final planting date is removed, and the acreage report has become the planting date. If you don't make that acreage reporting date / planting date in the growing season you intended, you carry over and your coverage will be in the next growing season. That's why you have to make all your selections for all 4 growing seasons up front. They added a planted acreage definition, and they made a clarification that annual forage cannot be planted into an established grass or legume. If you're sweetening the stand, so to speak, that is not considered annual forage. And then they made some special provision statements in the actuarials. They are limiting the productivity factors in Colorado and New Mexico to 100%. They're 60 to 150% in all the other states. The Colorado and New Mexico, they've backed them down. You can only have 100% of the county base value. And they also reduced the maximum percent of value in any one index interval in Colorado from 45% down to 40%. They added a new breaking statement in all the states. Coverage levels can be selected by growing season. So in theory, you could have different coverage levels for every one of the 4 growing seasons you are going to be selecting within. Don't know if that makes much sense or if that'll be done, but it is a possibility, so that is new. And we have new forms to accommodate all these changes. They are out on the portal as we speak. Here are the policy documents. You can see the forms at the bottom. The only changes to annual forage this year are the crop provisions. So we have the 18 RIAF. That is new. There's a Farm Bill amendment that just catches up with some of the Farm Bill changes, and they amended the basic policy for Rainfall Index, but the basic policy remains the same as it was last year. It's the 16 version. The Insurance Standards Handbook is the same as well. The changes have been in the annual forage crop provisions and then in the actuarial documents. Just a reminder what annual forage is compared to PRF. They both have rainfall coverage, but annual forage is for annually planted crops or forages. PRF insures perennial, so that's the main difference, hence the name. Still use the same NOAA data, the same intervals, but annual forage is designed to insure plants that are seeded or planted on acreage for forage or fodder, which is plant material you're going to feed the livestock, or you're going to graze it or hay it for livestock. The same acreage cannot be insured under both plans, but you could have a PRF policy covering your perennials and an annual forage policy on your annuals. So a little bit of an overview. Again, one sales closing date, July 15th. Coverage levels remain the same, but you can select them by growing season. Productivity factors, 60 to 150% of a county base value. That's going to be posted in the actuarials. 60 to 100% is a change for 2018 for Colorado and New Mexico only. And the county-based values is the value that RMA has put on the annual forage that is grown within the state. You can see the values by state. They do not vary across the state. So any annual forage being planted in Oklahoma has a county-based value of $169.16. RMA is looking at changing those from a state value to more of a county or area-based value like they've done for PRF, but that will not be for this year, possibly for next year. And then a reminder, different from PRF, annual forage, you have to insure all acreage that you plant. Any annual forage that gets planted on insurable acres has to be insured, unlike Rainfall PRF. And then again, no prevent plant, late plant, replant, etc. on Rainfall insurance. The grid locator, the decision support tool, all the historical indices are on the website in the same place. They operate the same way. We also have all those tools in our quoting system and more, so you can choose where you want to go, but that's the best way to determine whether this program is going to work for your producers, and those tools are the same as they were last year. Growing seasons. There's 4 available now. It's just a time designating the actuarial documents during which the crop is planted. So depending on when you get your annual forage planted will dictate the growing season that you are insuring in. Old growing season 1, last year's growing season 1 is the same as this year's growing season 1. The old growing season 2 from last year is now the same months and intervals as the new growing season 3. So 1 equals 1, 2 equals 3, so the 2 and the 4 for this year are the new ones. And you can plant in more than one growing season on the same acreage in the same crop year, but you can't be in consecutive growing seasons. So field reporting growing season 1 cannot be reported in growing season 2, but it could be in growing season 3 or 4. And then because everything just wraps around, if you have a field reported in growing season 4 for this year, you cannot report that in growing season 1 of 2019. Within the same growing season, insureds cannot elect consecutive intervals. That's the rule that's been applied to PRF and annual forage from day 1. You can have September, October, and also October, November because overlap of the October. And then, of course, same acreage cannot be insured in more than one grid ID or county during a single growing season. This is just a graphic illustration of the planting period for growing season 1 and then the available intervals. Just kind of gives you a better view, different perspective on how those growing seasons are laid out. Index intervals. Specific time in which precipitation data is collected, and that's where we come up with our grid index. So a lot of the same ones as last year, some different ones, and they're laid out a little bit different, as you'll see here in a little bit, but there's 6 index intervals per growing season for growing seasons 1 through 3. Growing season 4 has only 5 intervals. I'll show you that here in a little bit. 1 cat interval in each growing season. So if you choose cat, you're getting 1 interval for the whole growing season, and if cat is chosen in one growing season, it has to be chosen in all. So cat is cat, and you get it for the whole year. You can insure under any available annual forage interval within your growing season, but you have to choose at least 2 in South Dakota and North Dakota, and 3 in the remaining states. And then, as we mentioned earlier, months within intervals cannot overlap, and the intervals are limited by the growing season that you plant within. And then lastly, intervals act as mini insurance periods. What happens in one will not dictate the results of another. They're just kind of standalone mini insurance periods. No change there either. So this shows you the 4 growing seasons and the intervals that are available within those growing seasons. A little different layout than we've had in the past. You know, we had 2 last year, we have 4 this year, so there's got to be some overlap. If you don't get planted in the acreage reporting planting period for growing season 1, you have to have selected in advance the intervals you want in growing season 2. And then if that happens, your coverage will be preset for the growing season 2 when you intended to plant growing season 1. And you can see there's cat in each one of them, and you can see growing season 4 there's only 5 intervals versus 6. So the date you get your forage planted will dictate what growing season you're in, and if you miss the final date for growing season 1, your coverage just jumps into growing season 2. This is a summary of growing season 4. This is the one that's kind of different. It's only got 5 index intervals in it. Only if you're in North Dakota and South Dakota do you have all 5 growing season 4 intervals available to you. That's because, as you'll see in a little bit, North Dakota and South Dakota can have a minimum percent value of 50%, so they only need to be in 2 intervals within a growing season. All the other states have a minimum of 3, and if you have a minimum of 3 to prevent overlapping, you really only have in growing season 4 June and July, August, September, and October, November. If you're in North Dakota, South Dakota, you have all those intervals available to you. Again, percent of value has to be allocated on the application and the acreage report. You got to spread it between more than one index interval within the growing season, and it has to add up to 100%. Unless, of course, you have cat, and then you just have 1 interval for the whole season. So the minimum is the same as it was last year, and it's the same across all states. It's 10%, and then the maximum is determined by the special provisions. And you can see the maximum amounts, and you can also see the North Dakota, South Dakota issue I was just mentioning. The 50% allows you more options in growing season 4. And that percent of value then is applied to all your applicable grid IDs in the county for the growing season. So you got September, October, November, December, and February and March. Those percentages would be applied to all the insured acres and the grid IDs in the county for the growing season. You can mix and match your percent of values by growing season, but the same percent of value has to apply to all of your grid IDs if you are in more than one grid ID. And there's just a graphic of those percent values. You can see North Dakota, South Dakota are 50, Nebraska stands alone at 45%, and the rest of them are 40. Units, such as they are, for anything other than cat coverage, your units are divided by your growing season, your index interval, your share, your grid ID, and county. So those will be the standalone determinations within annual forage. And cat coverage is the same, except you don't have separation by index interval. They take the average of all the index intervals and come up with the cat value at the end of the season. So application, one application covers all growing seasons. That's due by 7/15. So all your normal insured header information, then for each county you have to have all the following information. The name of the crop is annual forage, the plant is rainfall, the coverage levels are shown. You can have 1 level per growing season if you wish to do so. Productivity factors, 60 to 150%, 1% increments, except Colorado and New Mexico. You have those per growing season as well. Intended use is not applicable for annual forage on the application. You report that on the acreage report. The growing season, you must choose coverage in all 4 this year. So regardless of whether the insured intends to plant in all growing seasons, they do have to choose the growing season and the index intervals within each growing season. 2 or 3 index intervals depending upon the state, and the percent of value has to be the same for all grid IDs in the county. You can't change it by growing season, but it has to add up to 100%. And all that information, as I mentioned before, has to be provided for all 4 growing seasons. Disclaimer is still part of the application and will come in with the application, but the grid ID and the point of reference does not come in until acreage reporting time. Here's a layout of the new application. We revised it to accommodate these changes, primarily down in the bottom matrix where you can see the growing seasons and the planting period and the acreage reporting date within each one of those 4 growing seasons to help you as you're filling out your application. Because you have to choose intervals in each growing season, and in most cases you have to choose 3 intervals in each growing season, there's no way it's all going to fit on the first page of the application. So we revised the continuation page as well, and you can see a mock-up of this, how it's going to look, because you have to select all 4 growing seasons. And in this case we're in Nebraska, so we have to have at least 3 index intervals in each growing season. It takes up a lot of room. So that's how your applications are going to look when you send them in. If you want different coverage levels within your growing seasons, you could do that. If you want different productivity factors within your growing seasons, you could do that here as well. Won't take up any more room, but you're going to have, in most cases, you're going to have 12 lines necessary to complete your application for annual forage in 2018. And acreage reporting obviously comes quite a bit later. The first growing season is going to be October 15th. So what they don't get planted by October 15th, if they get planted on October 20th, then that will carry over into growing season 2. All acreage has to be reported at the farm tract and field, and that's no change, but that is a requirement. And then anything that gets planted that qualifies as annual forage has to be insured. So if you don't get it in the growing season you intended, you still have to insure it in the next growing season, which is why we have to make all those selections up front. And the 4 acreage reporting dates align with 4 growing seasons. You can see them there on the slide. Have to do this through mapping so we can get to farm tract and field. All that will work as it has in the past, and very similar to PR Rainfall, if you're familiar with that, if you've insured under that. A few more additional fields are required under annual forage because we have to report the intended use, how the producer intends to get this forage into the livestock that he grew it for or ate it for. And then they want on the acreage report some more specific crop information. You can see an example here on the screen. If it's some non-grain sorghum, it's probably some sort of cane, and that gets reported at acreage reporting time. It doesn't affect premium, but they do want the crop and the crop type on the acreage report. So there you can see the acreage report must include the following for each growing season. So for every growing season that they're planning within, they're going to report their acres, and they're going to report the share, the intended use. You can see the list of intended uses there. Then the annual forage crop and crop type. If it's not listed, then essentially anything that they're planning that they're going to put in livestock, you can show as an unlisted commodity, kind of like a all others category. Haven't seen any irrigated practice, but there might be some out there. If so, then you report that. The planting date has to be reported, and then this is where you give us the grid ID and the point of reference from the RMA website. We still have to go to the RMA website to get that point of reference. You do that from the RMA historical indices page. All that is as it was before, and then you send in that point of reference with your acreage report. We do have to have that in. RMA requires that point of reference from their website be turned in with the acreage report for annual forage. Farm tract and field is mandatory. And here's the the list of the intended uses that you will choose from, and there's definitions in the policy for each one of these. Are pretty self-explanatory. Intended use so has to be included on the acreage report these do not go on the application. There's a field for the application on the field for this on the application, but it is not required for annual forage. That is for PRF, where you tell us whether it's haying or grazing, but you do not put these on the application for annual forage. And here's a list of the commodities or the subcrops, and you can see that unlisted commodity over there on the right. Does not affect premium, but these have to be given to us at the acreage report time. CAT, just a summary, if you do go CAT, it's 65% level, 45% of the productivity factor. If you elect it, it's for all growing seasons, $300 fee per year, not per growing season. So there's one index interval for each grid ID, and that includes all the months available in the county for the growing season, and then that is averaged over the entire growing season. CAT is not available for grasses and crops intended or used for grazing, so keep that in mind. And then the CAT units are divided as we've already mentioned. This is a new language for breaking sod, a new special provision statement that was added to all the actuarials. You can read it. Basically what it says here is if you've got new breaking or native sod and you want to ensure that those acres under annual forage, the deadline for that new breaking or native sod to have been tilled or destroyed is this coming July 15th. So if that has happened, it is insurable. If it's been broken by July 15th, it is insurable under annual forage, and it will have a subsidy reduction of 50 points because those are the native sod rules, and you can insure it with a higher premium, obviously, if you lose your subsidy on it. So keep that in mind. Probably not the best idea to insure annual forage on new breaking ground, but it is possible if you're willing to pay the higher premium. So in summary, annual forage insures annual crops, PRF insures perennials. All acres must be insured on your annual forage, which is different from PRF. And here's the big one: all current insureds must complete a new application, make the required selections in all 4 growing seasons by 7/15 to continue coverage. If you don't get that done, the selections that the insured had in 2017 will not carry over into 2018. They will have failed to meet the requirements of providing the correct and complete information needed for that application to be valid, and they will not have coverage for 2018. So you're going to have to reach out to all your current annual forage insurers and complete a new application with all 4 growing seasons included. 1 productivity factor and coverage level per growing season, 6 index intervals per growing season, except growing season 4, and 2 in South Dakota and 3 in the rest of the states for the index intervals because of the maximum amount you can have in each interval. CAT available, $300 per county, as we mentioned earlier. That is the end of the summary of changes. We've trained our marketing reps, we've trained our underwriters. If you have any questions at any time, reach out to those people. You can always contact me here in the Council Bluffs office, and we will help you figure out what we need to figure out. Thanks for your time. Have a good rest of your day.